All right. I just want to welcome everyone to this Krycklan Symposium webinar. It's a great pleasure to have so many people joining. This is the 17th annual Krycklan Symposium. In normal years, we usually have a big aula where we have our presentations with lectures. We have a mingle and we have excursions. And it's a 2 or 3 day event annually. Of course, for obvious reasons, we have gone virtual this year, which changes a few things around. But it also gives us opportunities. This year we have 164 participants, and that's of course a record, which is hard to break for us. I think we have peaked in 120 in a couple of years ago. So, and we have people coming from 7 or 8 different countries. So it's a great. I hope you have, if you are you waking up, if you come from North America, and I hope you are still awake if you come from South Korea. So anyway, you are all very, very welcome to this Krycklan Symposium. The question is, of course, what is Krycklan? And if you have never heard of Krycklan, maybe this is not the right symposium for you, or perhaps it is. Perhaps this is exactly what is the right thing for you. To join us today with a little excursion of Krycklan and our special theme this year, which is on forest ditches. But first, I will just take you on a little tour to the Krycklan Svartberget field site and field research infrastructure, where there's been more than 100 years of research in this northern site, far from most things, except for trees. It's a landscape for research, you could say. And we really do study forests, wetlands and peatlands, and lakes. And we study small streams, and we study larger streams. So this could say this is really what we're doing, is trying to understand this entire landscape and the process that is ongoing within them. We follow, of course, what happens when rain and snow comes into the systems and run through the system or stay on top of the system in snow over winter. We study how things are transitioning in from these different landscapes into small streams and into larger streams. And then what happens to the system when you have external pressure onto this landscape, such as forestry, deposition of long-range transport of pollutants, or climate change. So trying to grasp this entire landscape and understand what's ongoing within it. Krycklan is really a research infrastructure for system understanding or holistic understanding of a boreal ecosystem in what we could call in transition. I'll come back to the transition. It has gone ongoing for about 40 years. There's 40 years of research data collected in a fairly easily to get to database. It is about 15 monitored catchments. We have 200 groundwater wells, 1,000 soil lysimeters. We have 500 permanent soil and forest plots. We have a 150-meter research tower, part of the integrated carbon observatory system for carbon, energy, and water flux. And we have 2,500 hectares for experimental work, where you could conduct large-scale experiments. And for which one of those experiments we will focus today. And perhaps even most important, we have fantastically skilled technical and staff and research students, postdocs, and even some fairly skilled professors. So this is, you could say, Krycklan in a nutshell. It's a system where it's a research infrastructure where we try to understand the whole system. And it's really a landscape in transition. It's a lot of things is happening, and if you look at the entire landscape and try to understand what is going on, you really have to think about these big scale things happening right now. One is, of course, that the climate is warming. This is a time series where the last 40 years is from the catchment, and we have extended this time series back to 1890 using long climate record from the area. And one of the things that you can see is that's been quite variable over time, but especially the last 4 years been warming tremendously. And today it's almost 3 degrees on average warmer than what it was in the 70s and 80s. So it's really a warming trend that is ongoing, that is quite dramatic. It is a system that is experiencing changes in deposition. This example just showing the change in deposition of sulfur, or sulfate, I should say, and adjusted in the long term with the points, actual data from the site, and then model results for back to the beginning of the 1900s. So you could see it's a tremendous change of acid deposition in at this site over this time. And now we can actually see that there has been changes in the biogeochemistry in relation to this that is more large scale than what we previously anticipated. And there is a very large increase in tree biomass in the region. This including the site, the Krycklan sites, but more a larger area surrounding Krycklan. You can see using 1957 as our baseline here, and the relative change in biomass at this site over time. And you could see that we have about 50% more biomass in this region than what we'd had 50, 60 years ago. Despite the fact that forestry is more intensive now than what it has ever been before. So all of these things are changing over time, and that's what we try to understand and tease apart when it comes to biogeochemical processes. But today, we will take a more in-depth look at forest ditches, because it has there's a large increased interest in these questions the last couple of years. It's probably the least attractive part of a surface water system. So most people don't really like forest ditches. But it's also one of the perhaps most dramatic human reshape of the forest landscape. It has had there's been enormous amount of ditching ongoing in Sweden, and as we'll see in Finland, perhaps even more in Finland. And we'll look at the historical development over time and what the implications on this. And as we will see in later part today, there is a very large lack in understanding the past, the present, and the future effect, both on water storage and water quality of forest ditches. And also, what the big question is, what are we going to do with all these ditches out there? Are we going to ecologically restore those? Are we ditch cleaning them to regain forest productivity? Or are we just going to leave them as they are for free development? That's the big question. We have, for this, we do have the Trollberget Experimental Area, which is a platform for studying the management of forest ditches. And as you can see here, this is a map over Krycklan, and you could see that the Trollberget area at the bottom of this map is a small piece of that infrastructure, but just outside the research catchment, but still drains down, it drains into the Krycklan catchment. And these are the sites. You can see there are ecological restoration in gray, and then there's different ditch cleaning effects in green, and we'll come back into detail. But to just summarize what we're going to talk about today, I'll just introduce you to the Krycklan, the land of opportunity, and we'll then come into Elisa will talk about changing management of Myers over time. And then we have two invited speakers from Finland, Mika Nieminen and Hannu Martela, who will talk about Finnish perspectives. And then after a little leg stretch, we'll first have a Trollberget virtual tour. And then you can ask some questions about this specific thing about the tour, and then we'll have some talks for new projects starting up, primarily focusing on the Trollberget site and beyond. To ask questions, you can ask questions after each talk. There will hopefully be some time for that. And especially after the virtual tour, there will be some time for asking questions. And you do that by going into the Q&A box that you see on your screen. The bottom of your screen should be a Q&A box where you write in your question, and then you can upvote a specific question if you want by clicking like, and that'll come higher up in the list. By that, be aware the future is closer than you think, and if you watch closely, you can see what's in there for you. It's a little, oh yeah, same thing every time I do this. Remember, Krycklan needs you. And now the next speaker is Elisa Hasselquist.
Thanks, Hjalmar. I think you might, yeah, you're stopping sharing your screen. Let's see, get mine up. Of course. Is that working now? Are you seeing the presentation part? I hope.
Oh, I also see the
okay.
the
all right.
slide.
I'm doing the wrong thing. One. Sorry. Sorry. There we go. Is that better?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Great. So I'll be talking about the changing management of Myers over time, and that's mostly in Sweden, and primarily focusing on Krycklan and Trollberget. So thanks to their complexity, large water holding capacity, peat content, open surfaces, and distinctive plant communities, Myers play a key role for the region's water regulation, carbon storage, biodiversity, and cultural history. And yeah, just as a side note, I'll be using these terms Meyer and peatland interchangeably, and I guess lots of other people will too. So cultural history is important because otherwise we wouldn't really need to manage peatlands further, at least not in the way we're talking about today. Peatlands played a key role for the expansion of agricultural practices in northern Sweden and supported a growing human population by providing hay for farm animals. This meant that areas that were often managed by flooding to increase productivity of grasses or graminoids via catchwork irrigation systems. Here are some examples of pristine peatlands of different productivity levels. They were used to different extents for haymaking, and all but the lowest productivity peatlands were harvested. And here we quantify this in a figure where the x-axis is the productivity of the mire in the 1880s. It's a little bit backwards where 1 is the most productive and 100 is the least productive. And the size of the mires on the y-axis. The part that's green is the proportion that was used for haymaking, which we call mire meadows in this figure, and everything else, the yellow is unused. So the high productivity mires were used the most for haymaking, while low productivity mires were used less. Later, increasing international demand for sawed wood and square timber pushed the logging frontier inland and northward on the Scandinavian peninsula, where some of the same mires that were once flooded to increase hay production were now drained to increase forest production. This, combined with the belief that any wetland could be turned into a productive forest if it was drained, led to widespread digging of forest ditches. So drainage of peatlands for forestry has been most intense in Europe. 20% of the total peatland area has been drained, and 15 million hectares of northern peatlands have been drained for forestry. Today, we have invited speakers from Finland and Sweden because we're the most experienced at this, with almost 50% of the peatlands in Fennoscandia being drained for forestry. If we look at the whole timeline of the changing mire use, specifically for Krycklan, we found that mires were gradually converted for use as mire meadows or haymaking. And at its peak in the late 1800s, 22% of the original mire area was used for hay harvest. About 3% was then drained for intensive agriculture. And then drainage to enhance wood production followed. And about 40% of the original mire area is now forested. More productive mires have been relatively more affected by all of these measures. So this brings us to, as Hjalmar has already introduced, this new Trollberget experimental area where we're studying the effects of past human land use, namely ditching and ditch digging for forestry, and how we should best manage ditches to meet sustainable forestry goals. As Hjalmar stated also, we're studying ditch cleaning, ecological restoration of ditches, and just leaving them alone. The first map with ditches that we have from Trollberget is from 1904, where ditches within Stormyr were planned and likely dug the year after. Stormyr literally translates as big mire, and by 1939, the ditch network had been expanded beyond Stormyr to basically the ditch network we see today in the red lines. To put Trollberget into the context of Krycklan, I've delineated a new Krycklan boundary that includes Trollberget experimental catchments, and with our treatments of the wetland restoration, the ditch cleaning, and the ditches that are going to be left alone. And there are 2 catchments each of these treatments. But as we know, controls are important, and we need to control for the effect of these treatments. So we have chosen sub-catchments within the Krycklan catchment to use as controls. We have undrained peatlands as well as drained peatlands. And all of these are instrumented with weirs to measure water flow. They have eddy covariance towers and lots more that we'll see in the field trip later. So despite all this, Sweden, we're not the most experienced at ditch digging, managing, or doing research on the effects of ditches in peatlands, as well as measuring their downstream water quality. As you can see, Finland has many more ditches than we do. In addition, they've been maintained regularly. Sweden's really just starting to do research on this topic, so we have our Finnish experts here to share their knowledge on drainage and restoration. But I think there are a few things to keep in mind when listening to the Finnish researchers, just to have some context. There are some differences between Finland and Sweden that make pursuing research in Sweden about ditch management important, and that we're not just repeating what they've done in Finland. Certainly, Finland has published the most on research on ditch cleaning or ditch network maintenance, in part because they've continued to intensively manage and research their effects. But Sweden basically forgot about their ditches 50 years ago, and in general, haven't been cleaning them, and therefore hasn't done much research on the topic. It's something to consider that Sweden is typically only cleaning ditches just after clear cutting to compensate for the evapotranspiration of the forest stand, and thus the cleaning of ditches lowers the groundwater level to help tree seedling establish. And like I said, DNM is ditch network maintenance is rarely done mid-rotation in Sweden, but there's always exceptions, of course, and from the picture here. And there are currently government subsidies for ditch network maintenance in Finland, but this isn't in Sweden. But there is an increased pressure to get more from our forests as part of a bio-based economy, so perhaps this is coming. For example, Ulf Sikström has a new paper with others that found that forest stands less than 200 cubic meters per hectare could benefit from ditch network maintenance in a Swedish study. And all of this is at the same time that there's an increased focus on water quality from forests. So it's a very difficult balance. Furthermore, Finland has typically ditched every 20 to 40 meters in these regular spacing, as you can see on the left. While in Sweden, they're sometimes like this, but usually less regularly spaced and irregular, as in this photo from Krycklan. But understanding the historical and changing use of mires is important for the context of the rest of the talk, so it's great to have our Finnish experts here. So Mika is going to be giving his talk on the long-term nutrient leakage from drained forest, and he's from the Natural Resources Institute of Finland, which is called Lykke. And then Hannu Marttila will be talking about methods for evaluation of peatland restoration success from the University of Oulu, and we're really excited to have them with us. And as Hjalmar said, we'll have our Swedish researchers talk about their plans after the break. But that's the end of my talk. And I don't know if there are any questions. Doesn't look like it.
No, I think we'll come back to the questions for you, Eliza, since I used more than my time. I used some of yours as well. So, we actually need to move on. And Mika, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I try to share the screen now. Again, some minor problems with sharing the screen. Okay, you should be seeing my presentation very soon.
Yes, we see it.
Yeah. Okay, you see it. Okay, thanks. Okay, I'm going to tell you something about long-term nutrient and carbon exports from drained peatland forest, and I will start by telling you that our understanding of the nutrient exports from drained peatlands in Finland has changed very drastically during the past 2-3 years. And this was the earlier concept. We used to think that all the effects of forest operation on peatlands are only short term. The concept was such that we thought that although these different forest operations like this initial drainage increase nutrient exports, they always return back to the same levels as in undrained peatlands in a relatively short time period, like in 10 to 20 years. So that if there is only initial drainage, then after 20, 30 years, the exports from drained peatlands should be similar as from undrained peatlands. And when we estimated nutrient exports based on this concept, it was concluded that drained peatlands account for only about 1 to 3% of all human-induced exports in Finland. However, then we collected data where there were such sites that they had not been treated with any forest operation during previous 20 years. For many sites, it was 30, 40 years. And according to the prevailing concept, then those nutrient exports from undrained and drained peatlands should have been similar. But what we found was that the concentrations from drained peatlands were significantly higher than from undrained peatlands. They were 2 to 3 times higher. So now our present concept is that there is a kind of legacy effect of drainage, so that exports from drained peatlands are persistently higher than from undrained peatlands, even when there have been no forest operations for many decades. They are always higher. And after these findings, it became obvious that we have to re-estimate the contribution of drained peatlands to nutrient exports in Finland. And we did this very recently. We used this kind of concentration models to first estimate nutrient concentrations in waters discharging forested catchments in different parts of Finland. And then we used runoffs to get nutrient loads in kilograms per area. And in these our models, the structure was such that there was an interaction between drainage and location, so that concentrations were much higher in the south than in the north, and they were highest in areas where drained peatlands covered largest areas. And the overall outcome of this, our calculation, was that when we accounted for this legacy effect, nitrogen exports were about 85 megagrams per year, which is 50% of all human-induced exports in Finland, and phosphorus exports were 590 megagrams per year, which is about 20% of all human-induced phosphorus exports in Finland. So when we compare with those earlier estimates without this legacy effect, we can see that there is a drastic difference, there's a drastic change in our understanding related to nutrient exports now. Okay, then we have very recently also investigated TOC concentrations from drained peatlands. I just last week submitted this paper. We had a very considerable data here. We had altogether 133 sites, and what we found out that TOC concentrations were 20 to 35% higher from drained and undrained peatlands, and the difference was higher in the south than in the north. So we concluded that drainage of peatland for forest is one factor that has influence for the brownification. There are, of course, these more widespread factors like decreased sulfur deposition and climatic warming. But this study indicated that drainage of peat soils for forestry may be one contributing factor in very intensively drained areas such as in Finland and Sweden. Okay, but then these are not the only alarming findings related to nutrient and carbon exports from drained peatlands, because we have also found out that they may be increasing from drained peatlands forest. First, we found in our article that nitrogen concentrations in waters discharging from drained peatlands, they were much higher for the sites that had been under drainage for several decades compared with more recently drained sites. Then in the studies by the Finnish Environmental Institute, they found out that nitrogen and carbon exports, they were increasing in the rivers discharging into the Baltic Sea, especially into the Ostrobotnian Sea, and they also found that these increases correlated with the area of drained peatlands in the catchments of those rivers. And what is interesting here is that at the same time as we see increasing nitrogen exports in Finnish rivers discharging into the Ostrobotnian Sea, there are decreased exports in Sweden. So this tells us that these increase are probably not very much related to, for example, climatic warming, but these differences must somehow be linked to, for example, differences in land use between Finland and Sweden. Probably that in Finland, most of the peatlands around Ostrobotnian area had been drained, but not so much in Sweden. Okay, so there are these elevated and increasing exports, and what next? I think that we have to try to find out why these exports are increasing and how should peatland forest be managed in an environmentally sustainable way. And my theory why nutrient exports are elevated or increasing is that our drained peatlands are very much drying out. One reason for that is that we are now excavating much deeper and wider ditches than we used to do, for example, 20 years back. And one is, of course, climatic warming, but I think that the most important reason for that is that our peatland forests are still growing and maturing, so the evapotranspiration capacity is increasing. And this, of course, results in that the water level drops lower and lower, and this may induce that peat mineralization increases also in the deep peat layers, which may induce that carbon and nitrogen emissions and nutrient and carbon export increase. There is already studies that show, for example, that carbon and nitrogen emissions are much higher from the sites where water table is low compared to those sites where it's higher. And we find now that controlling water level, peat mineralization is key to more sustainable forestry on peatlands. And we find that continuous cover forestry would be the most promising alternative to the present even age management option. I have here listed some economic and environmental reasons why continuous cover forestry could be a better alternative to even age management. And as regards these economic reasons, a serious problem in even age management is that it is a very costly management option because it requires considerable money inputs. We use ditch cleanings often 2 to 3 times during rotation. Then after clear felling, there is site preparation, there is planting and seeding, and often those seedling forests need to be tended to 1 to 2 times. And compared to even age management, this continuous cover forestry would involve significantly less money inputs. We would mostly rely on natural regeneration and biological drainage of the remaining tree stand, so that there would be no much need for artificial regeneration or ditch cleaning. And as regards environmental aspects, serious problem with even age management is that clear felling raises this groundwater level usually by 20 to 40 centimeters. It induces reducing conditions which increase methane emissions and also phosphorus, nitrogen, iron, DOC exports. And of course, this cleaning operations increase sediment export. And then there is this problem, as I already told you about, that these drained peatlands may dry out, in especially the stands that are approaching the clear felling stage, so peat mineralization may increase, increasing carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide emission and nutrient and carbon exports. So compared to even age management, we found continuous cover forestry preferable, especially because groundwater table would be more stable. It would not rise very high or drop very deep, and of course, it would also be a benefit that we would need ditch cleanings less frequently. Okay, and we already have some preliminary results related to this continuous cover forestry, and they are very promising. We have, for example, investigated nutrient exports following continuous cover harvest and compared it to clear felling. And as you can see, the exports after continuous cover harvest are significantly lower compared to this clear cut. This is our first site studying these nutrient exports. Then we have measured greenhouse gas emissions from these continuous cover harvest sites, and we have found out that as long as groundwater level remains below 30 centimeters, then there are no methane emissions. And we have also already simulated the profitability of this continuous cover forestry, economic profitability in these simulations. We have a varied harvesting interval, and we have also varied post-harvest basal area. And the outcome of these calculations was that the net present value was varied from a little over 8,000 euros to almost 12,000 euros, and this was significantly more profitable option than even age forestry, where net present value was only about 6,000 euros. Okay, this was very much what I wanted to tell you about. In the end, my presentation was not only about those long-term nutrient exports, but I also wanted to tell you where we are now heading in Finland with these drained peatland forests, which are the most important research questions. And this continuous cover forestry is really a very central research questions in our institute, and also in, for example, in the University of Helsinki. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mika. I have a question for you. Could you first turn on your video?
Yep.
Oh, good. And this, I think, was a general request for the speakers. If they can have their videos or picture on them somehow, that would be great when they talk. And I promise to turn my media off, so you don't have to look at me all the time. Very good talk. We do have a question from the panel here that are specific to your question. This comes from Jan Seibert. Mika, are the schematic groundwater variations on slide 10 based on observations? In other words, does it matter where in the landscape you observe the groundwater levels?
We have measurement of course groundwater levels for very different types of peatland forest, and we usually find that we have articles related to that, and we find that water levels really drop down when the tree stands, the volumes increase. There is a very clear correlation, and we have concluded that evapotranspiration of the tree stands is a much more important factor for water table level in these mature forest than, for example, how these sites are drained, how intensively they are drained.
Good. And this is just a question for, I want to promote this opportunity to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom thing and write in questions, only write specific questions to the specific talk, so that we can ask those at the end. I have, Mika, one question is what is the general perception of ditch cleaning in Finland? Is it discussed a lot, both in like politicians and foresters and scientists, or what is the level, what is happening there?
Yeah, it is discussed a lot, and the general attitude now is that we shouldn't do that very much, but we should more rely on the biological drainage of the tree stand. Actually, last weeks, for example, a very big forest company in Finland, Metsä Group, they already recommended that they should not manage their forest according to the even age management, but should start to use continuous cover forestry. We are very much talking about these peatland forests now because of those new findings related to these nutrient exports, but also because we find that those problems may be increasing even in the future. Also, greenhouse gas emissions may be increasing in the future when these peatlands dry more and more.
Yeah, and I mean, but at the same time, you have, what is it, 24% of your productive forestry is on drained peatlands. So it affects huge areas of Finland.
Yes, it's economically a very important issue, and the problem is that we have harvested our mineral soil salts very intensively during last years, and the reserves now are mostly on those drained peatlands, so we should more and more focus our harvesting there.
Good. Well, thanks a lot, Mika. And I will now turn over to Hannu Martola and your talk. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here. Thank you, Jalmar. And thank you for inviting me. Yeah, I need to share the screen just a second. Hopefully you can oh, not. Hopefully you can see it now. So my talk today is about the methodologies to evaluate the peatland restoration success. In Finland, we have also done a lot of restoration. We have a lot of these peatland which has been unsuccessful, and these areas are now used for the restoration purposes. So of course, one of the scientific questions and also the management question comes to that how we can evaluate this success of the restoration, especially to developing the methodologies. And I would like to acknowledge all the people in here, but especially this Lauri Ikkala. He has provided a lot of material for this presentation. He is currently doing the PhD, especially related to drone technology. So as I said, we need like a better tools for to evaluate this restoration success. And as you already heard, in Finland we have a lot of forastages. Currently, we have peatlands about 8.7 million hectares, and from those drained ones are almost half, even. So actually, we have already lost some of the peatlands in Finland due to the drainage, and it mainly have been drained for the land use purposes, forestry, agriculture, peat extraction, and more and more there has been interest to restore some of the sites, especially those sites which has been close to the protection areas, natural parks, and those areas which has been like unproductive especially for forestry point of view. And this is just one example of the area, like a peatland marching. We have an open peatland here, and then they basically in the restoration idea is to mainly fill up the ditches and restoring the water level back in the peatland. But we are missing this kind of quick tools to evaluate the success. So when you started to do these restoration actions, the next question is that how successful it has been. And they have a lot of interest to develop further these methodologies for the restoration. And in this part, especially science has a lot of to give. The challenges in peatland restoration and also the evaluating the success is that quite large spatial coverage. Many areas are very, very large. You might hectares in area. Normally, it's quite labor demanding work. In traditional, it has person enter into the peatland, it's walk around and making this visual evaluation, which is quite slow. And And then also some changes are occurring slowly. Like Mika already described, some land use influence on the peatlands. They might be decades that before we are seeing some changes. And it's same in the restoration. Some changes are happening very fast, but some these changes we've seen after several years or even tens of years. Then we have a lot of high natural variation, so local conditions need to be taken out. Land use history is affecting, especially if there has been some fertilization in the area. And then the hydrological aspect, water pathways, especially from the surrounding catchment. So, for example, this is example that we have drained peatlands in the surrounding area, and this most deepest section of the peatland has been untouched. But because of these ditches are blocking the subsurface flow and some groundwater seepage on this natural peatland, it started to slowly to modify also these untouched areas in peatlands as well. Another example how this changed peatland might look. So this is the before drainage in the 70s. We have this kind of peatland margin area close to the mineral soil, and here is just before the restoration how the areas it has been drained, and then this deepest peat has been it's untouched from the drainage, but basically it has been affected by the drainage operation due to these groundwater connections. And these are something which are very difficult to also to assess in when you are restoring these sites. So there are a lot of methods how to evaluate the success. In this talk, I will focus mostly on these hydrological and water quality aspects. I touch a little bit the vegetation, but I don't know go the details in the greenhouse gases on some or fauna studies. But typically, traditionally has been done with just a visual investigation or expert judgments. But the challenge is that it needs the field visit, special expertise, and we cannot cover all the details typically. Then there has been a lot of monitoring from the hydrology. We can monitor changes in local water table in the peatlands, changes in the runoff, changes in the water quality in the pore water or runoff, and flora and fauna. But the challenge with these ones that they're very expensive, and we cannot monitor all the sites just due to budget issues. And again, there's a high local variation, meaning that we need to have a very select, very representative sites. We can use modeling as a tool, but typically the models needs a lot of background information so that they can actually reproduce all the main physical information for the site. And then you can use some spatial mapping. Satellite data is still too coarse nowadays, but these drone and UAV methods, they are opening a lot of new possibilities. I'm touching this as well in the later on. So what we have been found from these traditional methods that we install in just the piezometers on the peatlands to check in the changes the water level and or in the pore water quality. We have noted that they're very important to produce in site-specific information and knowledge. But to get this kind of information, we need many sites. And for example, these studies, which these figures are coming from, are a collection of about 30 sites across Finland. But what we have noticed that water level is typically restored very fastly, typically within 1 year already, filling the storage in the area. But the water quality is taking much more time. But again, in many of the sites, the water quality is restored back within the 5 years in majority of the sites. But we have also noticed that some of the sites are posing risks for the further this increase in water quality, and this is one of the example that if you have a mesotrophic site, for example, it might be that this increased level of the DOC or phosphorus or especially iron might be much higher from these mesotrophic sites than from other sites. From the runoff analysis, we have noticed that the restoration is restoring actually the hydrological functioning rather well. For example, specific yield runoff coefficients, they are restoring more closer to the natural sites. So we have here a situation where we have a drainage situation, and then we are some years after the restoration. And here in the gray, we have the boundary for the natural counterparts. So we can see, for example, specific yield in the catchment, it has been restored, but then there are some variation due to more dry areas in the sites. So basically they produce a lot of very important information, but they are very labor demanding. We can use modeling. For example, this is example from the hydrogeosphere model, which is this fully coupled surface groundwater model, which was established one of the restored site. And we can get a very detailed information about the saturation or groundwater table on the site. But this demanding a lot of information, and it's in practice we cannot set up on the many of the sites. We can use the isotopes as well to see the groundwater influence. This is the one example where we have aquifer here, which is pushing the groundwater to the peatland area, and just sampling the pore water in the peatlands, we can start to identify the location where the groundwater is playing the higher role in the peatland hydrology. And especially in the restoration point of view, this gives a lot of information that where, for example, this ditch blocking or some other actions need to be done. But then the drones. I'm not going to talk about satellites or airplanes, so I'm going to focus on drones because they have given a lot of flexibility, and they are more common and tool in many this evaluation work, also in the peatland restoration. And this work is part of this very large Hydrology Life EU-funded project, where main goal is to restore peatlands, but also to develop the methodologies for the evaluation. And our part is to check in how we can use small drones or bigger drones for the scientific needs, practical operational needs, and also for the documenting the sites. But we need to do a lot of in-situ measurements as well, especially in the developing phase. So we are doing a lot of moisture mapping, groundwater level, isotopes, ground control points, and some water sampling, soil sampling to validate and calibrate our methodologies. This also, there's a lot of work to be done, how to treat the data, how to do the image analysis. And this is just example. If you just take a picture from the drone, it looks like this, where, for example, the trees are blocking the visu. But when you're doing the refit-right orthophoto with the correct way, you can start to see the details in better way. A main principle in all of this photography is that you studied you're collecting many of these drone data together, having overlapping each other. It makes possible to make very detailed orthophotos but also very detailed 3D images from the sites. So drones, basically they offer a lot of possibilities for different kind of evaluation. We can have just a normal this camera to making the ortho mosaic just for the visual observations. This can be very of potential just to quickly evaluate that is how successful there has been, for example, the blocking the ditches. When we add in some signals to the same images, we can have very precise centimeter scales, digital surface model. We can start to play around with the water movement in the peatlands. If we add in the multispectral camera on the drones, we are getting also these near infra photos. We can start to more checking that how the vegetation, for example, is changed with some specific vegetation indices. With the thermal cameras, we can get the temperature mosaic, and also just to identify, for example, groundwater seepage location, but also we can start to map the surface moisture. And this is one of the things which we are now developing. We have very promising these results, but it's still needs further developing before be taken into action. Laser scanning with we can see also below the canopy. So we can have this point cloud and digital terrain models. So we not only have the information from of the soil surface, but we also have information about how the canopy structure is looking like. And then if we are using this hyperspectral camera, which are not that common yet, there's indication that we can might see some chemical composition as well. But this is still under developing. So, but especially for the open peatlands, these drones are excellent. You can have this orthomosaic, which for the elevation model, false coral images for the vegetation images, and thermal images, for example, for moisture index, to produce this information to evaluate the restoration success. So some take-home messages. I think we need some traditional methods. We need the experts this knowledge. We need to still to monitor our peatlands, but this kind of UAV-based methods, they are bringing new aspects on the table, and we can get much better this spatial coverage information. So there are potential that they are giving a lot of information for the scientific needs, for the operational needs, and especially also this high resolution documenting for the future needs. So there might be some questions which we are not ready to answer now, but maybe in 10 or 20 years, we could use this high resolution information again for answering some other questions. There are a lot of methods developing now, but already now they are showing potential that we can analyze the topography and surface water flow paths, soil moisture, spatial water table in the peatlands, vegetation analysis, and also provide quick and also the detailed evaluation. But there are still further studies need to be done, and especially to validate these methodologies on the northern peatlands. So that was my talk. So tack så mycket.
Thank you very much, Hannu. And we do have a question here from Anna-Lena Axelsson asking, are there any studies where you connect data from drones with those data from satellite missions? Do you know of any of that?
Yes, there are some studies. For example, one of the, actually this doesn't relate to peatland restoration, but it's related to one of our other study sites in northern Finland, Pallas, where we are combining this drone data with the satellite SAR data sets. So satellite can produce some soil moisture and the drones are producing some other data sets. So there are possibilities, but still the resolution is something which is causing some challenge. The satellites are not that high resolution yet.
Good. Well, one other question that I have is what is wetland restoration success? What is the most important
That's a good question. I was actually planning to discuss about that a little bit in early my talk, but so it's more like a bit philosophical. So you might need to have different kind of goals. If you do restoration in the protection area, then the goal might be that you need to get certain flora and fauna back on the region. If you want to if you have a modified hydrology in your catchment, then the success might be that if you just get the if you're able to restore the hydrological function back. And of course, another key issue, interest is nowadays that to get this carbon accumulation back in the peatlands and of course, if we can get that process back, then it's from this climate change mitigation. At that point of view, that's a success. So it might have a different goals in the.
Yeah, I think that's something to think about a lot. I mean, that's what the goal is. Before we take a very quick break, you have one more question coming in here from Klaus Holger Knorr. Did you also test the use of radar backscatter from satellites to monitor moisture? Or could that be inferred also from multispectral UAV cameras?
We haven't done, but there's something work done in University of Helsinki about that. But I don't know the details about that, but it's some other groups are testing it. So
good. All right. Thank you very much, Hannu. For all participants, we will now take an 8-minute break, a leg stretch, and we will start again at 14:10 sharp by showing you doing our little virtual field trip to the Trollberget area. Welcome back then. So 14:10. My name is Hjalmar Laudon. I'm a professor in forest landscape biogeochemistry at the Department of Forest Ecology and Management at SLU. I'm here to talk about the Krycklan catchment infrastructure and more specifically about how that connects to the new research infrastructure at Trollberget. Krycklan has a long history. The research started already 100 years ago on regeneration of forest. About 40 years ago, it was more process-oriented research that began on hydrology, biogeochemistry, and ecology of catchments and small streams. Today, the main activities of the Krycklan research infrastructure, or the Krycklan catchment study, which is also called, is to work on 3 different aspects. One being the long-term climate effects on the hydrology, biogeochemistry, and ecosystem. We work with the transport and deposition of long-range transport of pollutants, and it can be anything from the past legacy effect of acidity to the effects of the more emergent pollutants such as organic pollutants and some new battery elements. And lastly, we work a lot on the land use change effects on hydrology, water quality, and carbon dynamics on the different aspects of the forestry and other changes in the land use that we see. And that's how the Trollberget research infrastructure comes into the picture, because
2 years ago, we were approached by the Forest Agency and the County Administration Board who wanted us to be involved and take the lead in the effect of ditch cleaning and the effect of wetland restoration. And together with those two and Holmen Skog, we started a project that is now developed into what we can see today at Trollberget and what we'll look at in this little film. So through the EU project called Grip on Life, we now have not just an ordinary monitoring project, but also which now has developed into something much larger, involving about 25 researchers and funded about 10 larger research projects. And I hope you enjoy this little virtual tour. Welcome.
In the Nordic countries, peatlands have been drained for forestry for more than 100 years. In Sweden, based on the idea that any mire could be turned into a productive forest, and through support from a public works relief program, state subsidies were granted to private landowners to drain peatlands and wet forests, with a peak in ditching during the 1930s. In Sweden, these ditches have not been regularly maintained and more or less have been forgotten about. Additionally, many of the drainage projects were unsuccessful at increasing forest growth. Thus, we need to better understand how to manage these ditches in the future, but due to sometimes conflicting societal needs for increased forest growth for biofuel, carbon sequestration, and water security, it's not always clear what the best strategy should be. The new Trollberget research infrastructure has been set up to test the outcomes of different types of management of forests around waterways and wetlands. A key component of this is testing different options for ditch management, namely ditch cleaning to maintain drainage, blocking of ditches to ecologically restore the wetland, or to just leave them alone. At this site, we have 2 catchments each that are about 5 to 10 hectares in size of these different treatments. Within each of these management actions, there are researchers studying mercury formation and transport, water storage and flow, nutrient export in water, sediment transport, groundwater levels, greenhouse gas emissions, which includes an estimate of the carbon balance. And even we're measuring the age of carbon being exported from these sites. To do all of these measurements, the site is fully instrumented. The ditch cleaning catchments were harvested in summer 2020, and the ditch cleaning will happen in fall of 2021. The restoration of the unproductive peatland will occur in fall of 2020. Additionally, we're testing whether wide or narrow riparian buffers are effective at mitigating or softening the effects of final felling on stream and riparian ecosystems. Within the riparian buffer experiment, researchers are studying nutrient export in water, nutrient processing in the riparian zones, sediment transport, groundwater input into the stream, groundwater levels in the riparian zones, greenhouse gas emissions in the riparian zones and the stream, the quality and quantity of leaf litter inputs to the stream, and decomposition.
One question that have come up is, and that Eliza alluded to earlier when she presented her stuff, is that what about the controls? Because in Trollberget we don't have any controls, and that's where the closeness to the Krycklan catchment plays a very important role, because we use the Krycklan site, the long-term monitoring Krycklan, as the controls for these treatments that we're doing in Trollberget. So that gives us a possibility to look at the long-term effects in a controlled manner. There's also right now, as we speak, there are three eddy covariance systems that is being mounted, one on the wetland restoration sites and then two on the different ditch cleaning treatments, one on the where we'll ditch clean and one where we will not ditch clean. We have one from John Seibert. How were the different treatments assigned to the different sites and how might this influence the results? Well, of course, that's a good question, Jan. What we did was to, I mean, the controls, of course, in Krycklan, because that's where we have the untreated controls, also based on some they've also been ditched in once upon a time. The difference between the ditch cleaned and non-ditch cleaned in Trollberget was assigned by more or less randomly looking at them and then pulling out of a straw out of a hat. But it's also, of course, it has to look at the feasibility of the ditch cleaning and if the sites were planned to be ditch cleaned or not from the Holmen Skog, because this is a part of their, we wanted to look at the natural, or not the natural, but the we wanted to look at the different effects of what the forest companies are actually doing. So that's why we did that. A question from Leonard Hendriksson. Do you study not only the sediment transport but also situation, also siltation, the effect of sediment transport? Are studying together or natural effects? Yes. We do look at both sediment transport and the siltation or the deposition of the sediments. Eliza, do you want to say something more on this?
Yeah, maybe that would. We're looking at both the sediment transport and the siltation, if I understand what you're talking about, and then this effect on natural streams. Yeah, the riparian buffer is on a natural stream, so that would be, or as natural as they come in headwater streams in Sweden.
Yeah, I mean, we should be very clear. It's very difficult to find a stream where there's been no human influence at all in the stream system. I mean, we looked. Eliza showed the history of this landscape. It's been tremendously used in different ways for quite some time. Right.
I mean, nearly every stream has been cleaned and straightened to some degree. So, but they all connect downstream, so it's I think it doesn't matter much if it's natural or not.
Yeah, we have a question from Sebastian Sundberg. Why don't you answer that as well? Do you plan to simultaneously monitor vegetation species responses to the treatments?
At least for the riparian buffer, Lenka Kuglarova has been monitoring the bryophytes. And then we also have some nutrient cycling using a phytometer, a willow planted, but basically in the ditch cleaning areas we haven't done any vegetation response, but in the restoration the county administration board has done pre-restoration monitoring of vegetation, so plant community composition. I think hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah.
But I think Lenka had a good point. She was writing me privately in the chat area that we can, I mean, we have before treatment in the riparian zone as a control. So and these other sites, we've taken data for at least a year before before these treatments are being applied. So not only do we have Krycklan as a control, we have this before treatment measurements.
Yeah, and that comes from for everything you should, or both the hydrology and biogeochemistry and the carbon flux. So
yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Ishibuffum asked a question here. Let's see. Are there plans to overlap additional global change experiments at the different sites? For instance, it could be exciting to look at changes in ecosystem properties at plot scale in response to increased temperature and addition or similar. That sounds like an excellent potential avenue for doing an experiment. That's not something that as far as I know, is done right now.
No,
you will see some more detail on these on what's going on and what's being planned in this coming 6 talks now that will very soon start, and to think about what is being done, what is being planned, and where are the gaps? I mean, there's always lots of gaps out there that could be filled by other people coming in and doing studies. I mean, what we are trying to do is to provide a platform to do research, and that's what Krycklan is about, is trying to open up the possibilities for others to come in and use data or use the field site to do different things.
Yes. Thank you, Hjalmar and Eliza. Let's see if I can start to share. Do you see my presentation?
Yes, we do.
Great. Okay. Thank you for letting me talk today. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Marcus Wallin. I work as a researcher at SLU in Uppsala. And I will talk today about 2 recent projects that we are starting up within the Trollberget infrastructure. And the talk, or the theme of the talk, will be ditch cleaning and wetland restoration and the effects on stream carbon. In contrast to Järvi's great talk, I will unfortunately lack quite a lot of results, but there are a few in the end. This will be more as a taste on what's going to happen. My angle to this project comes from a sort of a landscape carbon balance, very similar to Järvi's sort of view on this. And here illustrated by this photo from the Krycklan river or stream, which I guess many of you are familiar with. Historically, the carbon balance of this landscape has been determined by looking at the interplay between GPP, the gross primary production, and the ecosystem respiration. So the exchange, the terrestrial atmospheric exchange of CO2. A very old way, but this is traditionally how it was expressed. And then we were looking at the net ecosystem productivity, the difference between the GPP and the ER. This is nothing new, but more recently, to get a more complete net ecosystem carbon balance, the lateral export of carbon has been included in this. So the transport of carbon from soils to water, and in some extreme cases, this could correspond to up to 40% of the NEP. This is nothing new, but it's sort of slowly getting into studies on the net ecosystem carbon balance, that we need to include all the different flux terms, and this is one of them. I still would claim that the mechanistic connection between the lateral and the vertical carbon fluxes is still largely unknown. So this is sort of my angle coming into this Trollberget facilities. And one tool we can use to get some more information about this connection is to use carbon 14 dating. And we have previously used this on so-called whatever undisturbed boreal systems are, and where we have found that the LCE, the lateral carbon export, is dominated largely by contemporary carbon. The example here is collected from Audrey Campo's PhD work. And on the top level here, and I should say that this is collected from the Degere Stormy, which is one of the control plots we will use in the coming years. And in the top panel here, we have the stream data on 14C content on DOC, CO2, and methane in the water, in the stream water. And we see that all of this related to this carbon-14 age converted into a conventional age. We see that all of it is of modern character. So it's very fresh carbon coming out in this stream. And this suggests a rapid transfer of recently fixed carbon coming from terrestrial system and reaching aquatic systems. In the bottom layer, in the bottom panel, we see the peat profile connected to this stream, and where we again have the different carbon components on the aquatic side, which again, through the entire peat profile, suggests that it's mostly modern carbon, consisting of all those carbon components, despite that we know that in the solid peat material here, it's dated up to 7,000–8,000 years in the bottom layers. So this landscape has been accumulating carbon for thousands of years, but still what's coming out in our surface water is mostly a modern age, maybe up to 100–150 years old. And this is, I guess, a good conclusion that our old carbon stores, at least in this dimension, the transport from terrestrial to aquatic system seems to be stable. So although we have plenty of old carbon, it seems to sit there. We did a similar study, again led by Audrey, but here on the Forest Hill slope in the Krycklan C2 catchment, for those of you who are familiar with that. And again, this will be used as a control plot for our coming work in Trollberget. Again, we have the stream. I can maybe, we have the stream over here. This is data on 14C content on CO2 in the blue spheres and DOC in the orange spheres, collected during 3 different times of the year, from May to August and October. And there are some general things here that might be good to catch up with. Firstly, the stream seems to reflect what we have in the soil in most cases. Again, it's mostly modern carbon everywhere, but there are a few exceptions here. In the base flow and the medium flow conditions, higher up in the hill slope in the mineral soil, we determined some very old DOC up to 5,000 years. That signal was never visible in the stream, if it was a matter of that the DOC never reached the stream, or if it was masked when it reached the streams by all the fresh material, as we are measuring on a bulk sample. We don't know. But there are old stuff sitting here, both in the solid material, of course, but also in some dissolved phases. But as far as we know from now, it seems to stick there, and we don't see it coming out. So what happens when we start to mess around with those systems? We have this excellent opportunity now, I think, to use the Trollberget experiment to see what happens when we start to harvest our forest. In this extreme case, down to the left, restore our wetlands. I don't imagine that this will be the case for Trollberget, but still. Or when we start to ditch clean our forest ditches. What will happen then? And there are a number of different things that could potentially affect our sort of so far view on this stability. The physical disturbance is an obvious thing. When we start to dig in those ditches, what happens? We are exposing mineral soils. We are, of course, changing our groundwater levels and the flow paths, and by that also changing our carbon source areas. Clearly, we will alter the hydrological balance, both with this wetland restoration and also the ditch cleaning. And this could also, of course, change our metabolic pathways. And there are likely many, many more things that could affect our so far view. What do we know then? Yeah, both Hannu and Mika showed great presentations on the work that's been going on in Finland. And there are also some examples from Sweden. This is data collected from the Dalsjö experiment conducted a decade or 15 years ago, maybe. In Västerbotten, this is data by Jakob Schelker, where we saw, or they saw, that the DOC concentration and the exports are increasing following clear cut and site preparation. We also had this figure, which we have already seen today, from Finland, and this is about wetland restoration and the export, DOC export effects of that, and where we clearly see a strong signal from this mesotrophic system, whereas it was a bit more unclear what the effects were at the more nutrient poor systems. So we know a bit, but I will still claim that there is large uncertainties on specifically about those things we are talking about today: wetland restoration and ditch cleaning, what the effects are on the terrestrial aquatic transfer of carbon. So the objectives of the two projects we will be running the coming years are: what are the effects of forest ditch cleaning on stream carbon? Is there a risk that an old soil carbon store are mobilized? And secondly, what are the effects of wetland restoration on stream carbon? Increasing, decreasing carbon concentration and exports? We don't really know. And will it change the carbon character, including the age component? And the ultimate goal with this is, of course, to provide end users with a scientific basis for how these management practices affect the terrestrial aquatic carbon exports, including a time perspective. Some short project info. The funding is supported by Formas and the Lamska Foundation. The project starting this year and will move on or last for a few years ahead. A total budget of 5 million. And the main project group is Alberto Sanella, who's just starting his PhD and will work mainly on the projects at Trollberget. Karin Eklöf, Hjalmar, Mark Arnott from Glasgow, and myself are also involved. But there are for sure more people to be connected along the road. Focus will be on detailed status of ground and stream water at the Trollberget experimental catchments, following this sort of backy design that we have already heard a bit about, including the Krycklan and Digger site used as controls. In addition to this, we will do synoptic regional sampling campaigns of restored and non-restored wetlands, as well as cleaned and non-cleaned forest ditches. So sort of trying to understand how valid our findings from Trollberget are at a larger scale. The focus will be on the aquatic carbon components, and we will use isotopics tools to understand a bit more, and also look into a bit on the organic carbon characteristics. You have seen this figure before. We will mainly work with those two catchments on the wetland restoration, the western catchment outlet and an eastern catchment outlet, and also the 4 catchment included in the ditch cleaning, the ones that will be harvested or they are already harvested, and the ones that will in addition be ditch cleaned during next year. Some sampling. The first sample taken by Alberto, so this is a milestone for his PhD project. And the current status for the wetland restoration, pre-treatment sampling has been ongoing since 2018 by the great efforts from the Krycklan team. We are just now this week doing a pre-treatment groundwater sampling campaign, and then the wetland will be restored within a week's time. For the ditch cleaning side, again, pre-treatment stream sampling has been ongoing, and we had added isotope sampling since this year. And again, some kind of a pre-treatment groundwater sampling is just occurring this week. Although the catchments are harvested, but no ditch cleaning has occurred yet, as that will occur next year. I see that I'll write 2020, or I mean 2021. So finally, some data not much, but still some. And this is from the ditch cleaning sites and from the wetland restoration sites, just to give us some kind of a feeling on what kind of water quality we have here. We are familiar with this, low electric conductivity, low in pH, relatively high in DOC. Something interesting to see, that's the wetland sites. Although they are draining the same wetlands, they tend to have quite a bit of different chemistry. And it might actually be not so surprising, since the wetland is quite different in the different ends of it. Some first 14C CO2 data collected during base flow condition this March. And this is including the control sites in Krycklan, C1 and C2, and then 3 of the ditch cleaning sites. And what we see again is mainly fresh, young carbon in the CO2 component, although we found actually some aged carbon in the control site in Krycklan, which is also reflected in the 13C content here. So some interesting things already now, although we have very limited data so far, but more will come within the years ahead. So by that, I say thanks, and there are plenty of data that will be generated during the coming years, and I'm happy to discuss it more with many of you that might be interested. So thanks to the funder and funding sources, and for the Krycklan team and the research station.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Great to see this. We have a question here from Phoebe Morton. You saw the very old carbon mobilized in the soil water. You saw the very old water. Do you higher up in the forest hill slope? Have you considered the vegetation present in these areas? And is there a difference in the vegetation there compared to further down in the slopes?
Yes, to some extent it's a difference. I mean, we have more sphagnum-dominated riparian zones. There are more, yeah, what do you call it? Blueberry, lingberries dominated, or blueberry definitely in the more upslope sites. So there are for sure differences. The concentrations of the DOC are another aspect. There are much higher DOC concentration in the riparian zone compared to the upslopes. So we don't know if this DOC never reached the stream, or is it simply that it's just masked, since it's captured by a much stronger signal closer to the stream.
Okay, so what's your hypothesis? What's the prediction when it comes to the DOC? Is DOC, CO, and DIC, when it comes to the age, going in different direction when it comes to restoration and ditch cleaning?
We don't know. What we saw from this previous studies is that it seems to be quite a clear difference between the DOC and the CO2. The ultimate source for this is not the DOC, according to those. So what will happen when we cut down the trees and then ditch clean? We don't know. Is there a risk that we start to mobilize? I mean, that's the hypothesis, that we might start to mobilize old carbon that has been sitting there for thousands of years. But yeah, who knows? This is something that will be exciting to see.
Very good. Thank you very much, Marcus. And that brings us into the next 4 presentations. And those 4 presentations are all coming from, are all funded by the Swedish EPA. So that's why they come in a block of these 4 talks, starting with Karin Eklöf. Karin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, I think you see my PowerPoint now. If you don't see it in presentation mode, please tell me.
It's okay, perfect.
Good. Yes, I will talk about our project Ditch Cleaning versus Wetland Restoration Effects on Mercury in Water. And this project is funded by the Swedish EPA. It started this year and it will continue for three more years. And as it started this year, I will not present any results today. That will come at a later stage, but I will introduce the project for you. And my name is Karin Eklöf. I'm a researcher at the Department of Aquatic Science and Assessment at SLU. And this is the other project members, Hjalmar Låden at SLU, Ulf Sikström, Skogforsk, Therese Zetterberg, SLU, Ali Amelie from the University of British Columbia in Canada, Johannes Tivari at SLU, Eliza Meyer Hasselqvist at SLU. And we're also cooperating with a lot of other researchers at the Trollberget site, and also the participants in Grip on Life, IP, and the infrastructure in general. So Holmenskog, the Swedish Forestry Agency, and the country boards. And as you have heard today, many of the ditches draining forest areas are today function poorly in draining these areas. So we will evaluate two alternative actions: ditch cleaning versus to maintain the forest production, or wetland restoration to restoring the wetlands to more natural wetland conditions. And both of these activities, they may increase both the mobilization of mercury from the soils to the water bodies, but also the methylation of mercury, the transformation of inorganic mercury to the bioavailable and toxic metal mercury. So why are we interested in mercury? We have high mercury concentrations in Sweden. The concentrations in the water are accumulating and bioaccumulating in the aquatic food webs, causing high fish mercury concentrations that are greatly exceeding the European Water Framework Directive for good ecological status, and that is in all of Sweden's water bodies. And the concentrations in the fishes are also exceeding the threshold for fish as a food source set by the WHO in approximately half of the water bodies in Sweden. And in addition to high concentrations in fishes, we also have the situation that even if the mercury deposition have decreased during the last decades, the input to the catchments are generally at least higher than the output, and the output is then the runoff and the re-emission together. And this caused the mercury to accumulate and increase over time in the soils, and especially in the O horizon, where a lot of the mercury is accumulating. Thereby, all activities and management that is made in the catchments are of high interest, as they could then increase the mobilization of mercury from the soil storage to these sensitive aquatic ecosystems. And there is a lack of knowledge on how ditch cleaning are influencing the mercury concentrations in the streams. There is one former study, that's the DIVA study from IVL, but there is many questions remaining, and more research is needed to understand how the rutting in this near ditch zone and how the erosion of particles and carbon are influencing the mercury in the ditch water. It's also likely that the mobilization, but especially the methylation of mercury, increases after wetland restoration. The methylation of mercury is made by some groups of anaerobic bacteria. These bacteria then establish in oxygen low conditions, and they are also promoted by high humus content, and both of this is often the case when flooding peatland and restoring a wetland. Most of this project will be conducted in Trollberget, and we will focus on the 6 sites, the 2 harvested and the ditch clean sites, the harvested only sites, and the wetland restoration sites. And as Hjalmar and Eliza said before, we will relate the concentrations in the ditches to 4 undisturbed references in Krycklan. The sampling was started already in 2018, and the sampling for mercury then will continue at least until spring 2023 when this project ends. And this gives us then great opportunity to get a good evaluation of the effects on mercury in the ditches after forest wetland restoration happening this autumn, and also ditch cleaning happening next autumn. When it comes to the ditch cleaning, we are interested to know how concentrations and loads of total mercury and metal mercury, if they are increasing after ditch cleaning, and for how long these potentially elevated values are lasting. Will it be a peak just after the ditch cleaning, or will the effects be more long-lasting? In the DIVA study, there were signs of that the mercury concentrations peaked just after the ditch cleaning, actually just within the first day after the ditch cleaning. Are the potentially elevated concentrations of mercury mainly associated to particles or to dissolved fractions? If mercury is mainly bound to particles, they may settle quite soon downstream and settle in the sediments, but if they are bound to dissolved fraction, they will probably have more long-lasting effects and more downstream effects. And we will also evaluate sedimentation ponds or sedimentation traps, if they can work as a mercury methylation hotspot. Sedimentation ponds, they can look a little bit different. This is a sedimentation pond in another ditch cleaning experiment in Uppland. And this is a site where we probably have a quite high mercury methylation rate. There is a lot of carbon in this pond. There is also quite low oxygen when the water slows down and when the particles and organic carbon are settling in the pond, etc. And these ponds, they are made to maintain the water quality to the downstream ecosystems, and it probably work great for particles and organic carbon, but we may then have metal mercury producing in these environments, and that is very important to know. In the wetland restoration, we are mainly interested in metal mercury, as the metal mercury is what we are hypothesizing that will mainly increase after wetland restoration. We also hypothesize that these potentially elevated concentration will last for quite long times, as we are permanently transforming the environment to potential mercury methylation, high mercury methylation sites. In Trollberget, we will also evaluate how ditch cleaning influence the mercury mobilization in the ditch near zone. In Trollberget, the ditch cleaning is done in conjunction to a harvest, and that is quite often the case. And former studies that have evaluating harvesting effects on mercury in stream or ditch water have found that the main factor that is influencing whether we will get an effect in this, a negative effect of mercury in the stream or not, is whether the stream or the ditch is protected by a undisturbed buffer zone. And in the case of ditch cleaning, we will cause rutting, compaction, and disturbance in the very ditch near zone, and that will then potentially increase the mobilization of mercury and the hydrological connectivity between the harvested site and the stream or the ditch. And the superficial flow paths and flow rates will be modeled using hydrological model, hydrogeosphere. That will be informed by high resolution topographic mapping. As high resolution, so we will also be able to see evaluation differences in the tractor rods and in the ruttings. because these can be highly influencing the superficial flue paths. The figures here are from another project where we successfully used a similar approach and modeled the hydrological flue paths and flow rates between mercury methylation hotspots that were formed by stump harvesting and the drainage ditch. We will not only conduct research in Trollberget, we will also do a synoptic sampling to evaluate what catchments will release more or less mercury after ditch cleaning. We will locate these along the northeast coastline of Sweden, and the reason for why we want to be in this area is that there is this is an area where we have quite a lot of acid sulfur soils, and we are especially interested in how ditch cleaning on acid sulfur soils will influence the mercury concentrations, and especially then the metal mercury concentrations, because sulfur is very important to determine the mercury methylation rates. We will sample 50 ditches, and this will be done during 3 occasions, and we will choose the ditches to include a gradient in low to high soil sulfur content, and also recent and less recent ditch cleaning. And finally, we will also synthesize the results from this project with the literature in order to evaluate what catchments that are more and less favorable to ditch clean and or to restore, both in relation to mercury, but also in relation to forest productivity, as the forest productivity is the main goal for the ditch cleaning. And that was what I had to say about the project. And this project is then funded by the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency, Miljöforskningsanslaget, that is managed together with the Swedish Agency for Marine and Water Management. Thank you.
Thank you, Karin. Excellent work, and we are very hopeful that this will lead to interesting results. What's your speculation? From a mercury perspective? Where are the potential problems the greatest? Is it from wetland restoration, or is it from ditch cleaning?
For metal mercury, I would suspect it would be the restoration that will have more of an effect. But if counting like the total mercury, I would guess that the ditch cleaning can have more of an effect, at least temporarily. But I also think it's a risk that it could be more long-lasting than we think, because of this change in hydrological flow paths that we want to evaluate.
Great, thank you. With that, we move over to the next speaker, which is also on mercury related aspects with Mats Öqvist.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you, Hjalmar. So I will also present a project that was recently granted by the Swedish EPA from Miljöforskningsanslaget. And the question that we are asking ourselves is that, are restored wetlands hotspots for methane emission and mercury methylation? And we run this project as part of what we call a BEWARE project framework, where BEWARE stands for biochemical effects of wetland restoration. Looking at the background,
We all know that wetlands are unique ecosystems delivering important ecosystem services to society. And right now, the Swedish government has defined wetland restorations as a major national undertaking. And there are numerous authorities and landowners that are actively involved in this activity. And the same is to be said for other parts of the European Union as well as other parts of the world. And the major objective behind wetland restoration are issues such as increased biodiversity, increased carbon sequestration, increased groundwater storage, and improved surface water quality. But there is a risk that wetland restoration also can cause fundamental changes in biochemical properties. And these may result in undesired impacts and potential environmental threats from these activities. And two of those that we are especially looking into in this project involve methane emissions and also increased rates of methane mercury formation. And I think overall the impact of restoration on biochemical processes in wetlands are quite difficult to predict. Something about aims and approaches. We aim to compare both drained and restored wetlands to pristine, undrained wetlands, with respect to their potential for methane production, methane oxidation, and mercury methylation. And with this effort, we want to develop efficient restoration strategies that minimizes potentially adverse landscape level environmental effects on wetland restoration. We have divided this into a kind of two-phase approach. We're in the first phase where we compare pristine wetlands, the undrained wetlands, with drained wetlands, and to see how severe is the disturbance on the methane production, methane consumption, and mercury methylation. And then in the second phase, we will compare this pristine and drained wetlands with restored wetlands to get an idea of rates of recovery and change and what are the main effects or the integrated effects of wetland restoration. If we look at phase one, which we are currently embarking on, we have selected a number of sites outside Umeå, very close to Vindeln and the Svartberget research station, and also close to involving then the Trollberget site that we've heard before in previous talks. So what we have basically are these blue circles that we are natural wetlands, and the red circles that are drained wetlands. And all of these sites, both the drained and the undrained, are quite heavily instrumented. So we have continuous measurements of methane and CO2 fluxes with the covariance. We have groundwater table measurements, soil temperature measurements, and a lot more. And one example is the water table you can see on the right here, with a selection of 3 of our control sites compared to a drained site. So there's definitely a large difference in the water table as a result of the drainage. We also want to compare the pristine wetland with drained site, and I will give an example. As I said, we have not really generated so much results ourselves. But this is just data comparing the site at Trollberget with the site at Degerö. And in part, it's the same data that Järvi presented previously, but now in these figures, we also included the yellow dots here, which is then from the undisturbed site at Degerö. And this is then from the master thesis by Kasselgård. And what is quite apparent when looking at these is that you have these impacts of drainage that you have quite severe impact on peat physical and chemical properties. For example, the bulk density, the peat carbon and nitrogen content, and also the carbon to nitrogen ratio. And since the pecking order of natural science usually is that you have physical properties controlling chemical properties, which eventually control biology, it's quite reasonable to assume that these differences will have an impact on the biochemistry of the system. So back to our 4 sites. We have just finished a sampling campaign where we've been out to these in total 8 sites, and we've extracted cores from the top 50 centimeters of the profile. At each site we have 3 replicates, giving us a total of 24 cores. We take these cores, we bring them back to the lab. What we do is that we cut them in segments, so we get a fairly high resolution of the peat profile, and then we subject these segments to analytical work organized in 5 work packages. We have work package 1 and 2, where we want to identify the distribution of methanogens, methanotrophs, and mercury methylating microbial communities in these peat profiles. Work package 3, where we determine the rates of methane production and methane oxidation. Work package 4, we do the same, but for mercury methylation. And then in work package 5, we determine physical and chemical properties of the peat profile. I will give you an example related to methane dynamics, which is work package 3 of what we expect to find here. And we know from before that methanotrophs and methanogens are quite stratified in the peat profile. And in the surface, you have the methane oxidizing community, and in the bottom, you have the methane producing community. And they are usually distributed around an average groundwater table, symbolized by this blue line here. And it's the interaction of these 2 microbial groups and their activity that regulates methane emissions. So in fact, when we have a high groundwater table, when it moves up, the methanogens will become favored by that, probably increasing their production, whereas the oxidative zone decreases, mainly because oxygen diffusion down in the profile is restricted by the water table. And in a similar fashion, when you have a low water table, the methanogenic community is likely unfavored because of oxygen intrusion into the profile, whereas the oxidizers enjoy it because of higher oxygen concentrations, but it might also be suffering because of lower methane concentrations. And then, of course, with drainage, when you move the water table really, really far down, you might into a situation where you actually inhibit the methanogenic zone completely. So the idea then is what happens if a system that's been drained for 100 years with a low water table, probably quite inhibited or now non-existent methanogenic population, what happens when you raise the water table? So that was sort of the phase 1. The phase 2 is that we compare pristine wetlands with restored wetlands. And here we will use a selection of peatlands that were restored some maybe 10 to 20 years ago to get that kind of comparison. A little bit about our goals. So our aim, as we said, was to compare the potential for methane production, methane oxidation, and mercury methylation in drained restored wetlands with pristine wetlands. And then to use that to develop restoration strategies that minimizes potential adverse effects on landscape level and environmental processes. And the goal then is to define a set of easily acquirable wetland characteristics that will reflect if a specific restoration object can cause these adverse effects and what are the environmental consequences. And the vision here is to create some kind of toolbox for authorities and other actors that will ensure that restoration activities results in enhanced ecosystem services rather than negative or adverse environmental effects. A question to the audience. I'd really like to know if anyone has a sincere interest in wetland restoration. And if you do, please let us know. Because we are currently putting together a reference group for this project, and we invite almost everyone with any kind of interest in wetland restoration, especially coupled to ecosystem services. And it might be not only biochemistry, it might be ornithology or fishing or insects or whatever. So if you have a sincere interest in wetland restoration, in the ecosystem services that wetlands can offer society, I would very much appreciate if you could contact us. And with that, I thank you for your attention. And I'd also like to highlight my co-workers on these parties to the right. And we look forward to all the efforts in this project. Thank you.
Excellent, Mats. Okay, anyone that's interested in wetland restoration? I think we still have 109 participants, so there might be a few out there that could be of potential interest. I suggest that you contact Mats yourself, by sending an email or call him, and you can see his contact information down in the left corner. So please note that down and contact him.
No, we don't have to do this in real time right now, but please contact me if you're interested.
Yeah. Let's see. We did have a question. For some reason, oh, there we go. Something happened here to me. Let's see. There we go. From Elio Botagasio, are you also measuring N2O emission in drained and pristine peatlands? If not, why not?
We are not doing this in this specific effort, mainly because other people are doing that. So I think it's a little bit over the top. Having said that, along the line, we might add those kind of measurements if funding allows, for example, because now we have this systematic framework of sites. So that is sort of the next and one complementary step. But we will specifically want to look at methane emissions and the mercury methylation.
Yeah. We should probably say, if this is fair, Mats, but if somebody would be interested in N2O and wanted to tag on with their analytical skills, I'm sure that you would be interested in this, right? So there is.
We can definitely have a discussion, but one of the things that have been brought forward with wetland restoration is that you reduce N2O emissions. So it's a climate mitigation effect.
Yeah.
That is a general thought, at least that's prevailing right now. And alongside that, we do want to see, is there a risk for increased methane emissions that might offset this mitigation, for example? And that's the reason for focusing on the methane in this context.
Yeah. Good. Thank you very much. We will move on to the next speaker, who is Kevin Bishop.
All right. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Very good. And if you'd like to see me, I've taken a chance and hooked up a video, but I'm not able to start it.
Okay. But we don't care about seeing you. We just want to see your presentation.
All right. That'll be fine then. We'll stick to that. Great. Share my screen is the next thing.
Yeah.
Great. There we go. And then we go into hyperspace and try to do a presentation with it.
Good. Yes, and we can see it, so that's good.
Very good. So, all right. I'll get the next slide here. There's the next slide. Very good. So I will be presenting another one of these Naturvårdsverket projects on wetlands. This wetland is sticking with, or this project focuses on the hydrological function of wetlands. There is a great belief that having wetlands in a landscape, or belief, a knowledge that having wetlands in a landscape reduces the flow extremes. moderates the floods and keeps flow going during dry periods. So there's great desire to do this, implement this as a management technique, put in more wetlands. But when looking at the scientific evidence base, there isn't a whole lot on how wetlands themselves actually modify the stream flow, at least in the Swedish situation. A lot of hopes, but not much evidence, in part because wetlands are sort of everywhere. There haven't been many isolated wetlands to study. So the basis of this project was to find out how mires are modifying stream flow in the forest landscape. The answer that we're going to come up with is going to be a decision support tool. That SMHI has half of this project, and their role is to make sure whatever scientific evidence-based results we come up with are actually incorporated into something that managers can use at the local and regional levels. SMHI already has widely used information from the weather reports you get to how much drinking water you're likely to have. So they already have a tool for showing you what a constructed wetland, which is sort of like a bathtub, how that would work. But they'd like to have more than just these constructed wetlands included in this decision support tool. They're a key part of this project as well, with roughly half of the work. I should say they're also in charge of putting together a reference group. We've got 12 people signed up from the private sector, from communes, from Länsstyrelsen. And it's gone through my mind that since we have 4 or 5 projects on wetlands at SLU, we all need reference groups. Maybe we can share reference groups, but that's something to come back to later. How are we going to answer this question about how the wetlands work? Well, it comes down to the water balance. What goes in, what comes out, and when does it come out in particular? That doesn't seem like, how can you get funding to do that in this day and age? Well, I and many other hydrologists are actually guilty of thinking that a wetland like this isn't going to really do much for holding back flood tops, flood peaks in particular, because this is a landscape that is already filled to the brim with water. So if you add more water, how can this landscape actually do anything to hold back the water? It's probably the forest that's doing more. I had an epiphany, an aha experience, as you'd say in Swedish, about 5 or 6 years ago on the Degerö Mire with a guy named Jelmer Neep, a Dutch hydrologist. And he was out with a little watering can, pouring water in little round tubes on this wetland. I said, what are you doing? Measuring the hydraulic conductivity. I said, well, what's so great about that? Well, it says it changes. When it rains, this wetland expands. The Degerö Mire increases, it goes up by 10 centimeters, which is enough to hold 100 millimeters of water when it rains. These sphagnum moss, they have amazing strategies for holding on to water, even though they don't have stomata, if I've understood correctly. And ecohydrologists know all about this, but they haven't had a lot of interaction, at least in Sweden, with the runoff modeling community. So this project is a chance to make ecohydrology meet runoff modeling. And then we do have a secret sauce. And that is that what we really want to get at in this project is the ability of wetlands to store water quickly when it rains, and to release that storage during dry periods. And normally a hydrologist has the rainfall and the runoff, and we don't know that much about the storage, because we don't know that much about the daily evapotranspiration either. But on a number of wetlands in Sweden, thanks to the interest in greenhouse gases, there are eddy flux towers that have been going away for, in some cases, like Degerö, over a decade. And they have information about the water flux as well. So we're going to try to use that information to get a water balance we can resolve down to days or hours time to actually see what is stored there. And there are ways that we can actually measure the surface of that wetland in individual places with groundwater tubes and drones, ground-based laser. There are possibilities, but we're really going to add some new things to what has generally been done in looking at water balance. I hope somebody else has done this elsewhere in the world, but we haven't found it in Scandinavia yet. And we have some special ingredients going into this special sauce. One is Reinert Huseby Carlson, who worked on detailed water balances at Krycklan in the forested and mixed landscape for his PhD. And already I was looking back through one of his first presentations and said, what's going on with the mire? It's behaving differently, the C4 mire, which is one of the most mire we had. And we also have Claudia Teuschbein, who is handling the climate scenarios, because we want to understand how things will work into the future. And she's been doing remarkable downscaling scenarios and hydrological modeling at the Krycklan site already. So that's what we have here. And then, of course, a great team like that, new methods, you need data. And we've identified a number of sites that are natural, drained, restored peatlands, which should have data that could be useful here. Many of them with eddy flux towers. We're going to be starting at Degerö and Svartbjerg to contrast a mire in a forest. There's another sites area near Gothenburg, Mikkelsmossen, that could give us more. And then we have the Trollberget site, which even though it's new, the data coming out from there should be very interesting from this point of view as well. So that's what we're going to do. The basic steps, we put the data together. I should say that for Reinert's PhD on detailed studies of the runoff, it took him 2 years to put 5 years of runoff data together from 10 different sites in Krycklan. We don't have that kind of time, unfortunately, in this project. So we're going to have we're hoping the data will go together faster. Then we work hard on characterizing the storage and release of water by looking at the information we have on storage, rainfall, the hydrograph. And then it's time to think about models, possibly a very detailed ecohydrological model to start with. But in the end, it all needs boiled down into the S-HYPE, a very relatively simple conceptual model that SMHI is using as the basis for many of their products. So thank you for your attention. That is the project.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Do we have any questions to Kevin?
Love that. Everything's so clear.
Everything is so clear.
The same way all the time too, or I speak too quickly.
So Kevin, if you think about the runoff dynamics of a wetland compared to a forested catchment and to a lake, what do you think? What's the difference?
The lake is the analogy to the restored wetlands that the way SMA modeled it. Basically, the model restored wetland exactly like a lake. It's a bathtub that has a drain, and the drain, there's a relatively simple equation that could describe the drain to the bathtub. If it's just a lake that you're draining, of course, there's a catchment around the lake that holds water, especially in low relief areas such as the many lakes in Sweden. So it's not just a bathtub. That's part of what SMHI is hoping to learn about in this project, is how well their bathtub analogy works. What is the different about the wetland is you have these mosses that have their own way of dynamically changing their hydrological properties to manage water. That's different than soils. I mean, there's a bit of hysteresis in soil hydraulic conductivity and wetting and re-wetting and the soil moisture characteristic, but it's still nothing compared to the way a peat actually holds on to water. If this makes much difference, if it's going to require a model that's more sophisticated than the general linking up of conceptual reservoirs that we often use in hydrology, that remains to be seen. We've got to make it simple to make it useful for a decision support tool. But we'd like to get at that simple model for the right reasons, having understood why a mire is behaving the way it is hydrologically. A process understanding rather than just an empirical, well, here's the data we had, we fit a curve to it. That's great. Because if we're going to get into climate change, if we're going to understand how management actions like restoring or draining wetlands affect it, we need to understand, hopefully we'll do a better job with the processes. How much we'll actually get, how far we can get, we'll see. But it's really exciting to have the chance to try.
Good.
I've been avoiding wetlands all my career, but it's finally time.
Thank you, Kevin. Well, let's see, we have one more. A question from Stefan Blum, Kevin. Is there a role for these mosses in the forest hydrology as well, similar to the role in wetlands?
Absolutely. I mean, there is sphagnum in the forest landscape. Part of that sphagnum is forest growing on drained peatlands. We have the whole riparian areas that are very key buffers. I mean, how are those sphagnums in the riparian zone actually modifying what goes through the riparian zone? It's something that's not been addressed that I'm aware of in an eco-hydrological way. You know, it's the properties of peat and soil are different, even though you can put a saturated hydraulic conductivity number on both. Things to be found out. And actually, that's one of the things we're interested in this project, is not just how isolated wetlands work, but putting that wetland into a forest landscape, because there'll be a resupply of water to the wetland from the side in the forest wetland, in the fens, essentially, the riparian zone. But even a place like Degerö, this expansive wetland, is 30% forest area. I mean, there is water coming from the side as well. So, good question. I hope we'll get an answer for you.
Good, thank you. Well, there's one more coming in here. Lennart Henriksson. Kevin, do you think it's possible to get fewer floods by re-wetting? How many do you think it's possible to get fewer floods by re-wetting? How many wetland area are needed?
That is exactly the sort of question that we would like to be able to answer here. And I think it's not clear it's not clear what the effect of re-wetting will be. And that's why we really need the kind of science that's being done at Trollberget and looking at a variety of wetlands we already have in other areas to get some better understanding of that. So check back in a few years.
Good, thank you. All right, with that, I want to introduce our last speaker, which is Martin Futter. Before I let him online, do remember that both to post questions for him on the Q&A, and also we will have about 15 minutes at the end for anyone that wants to chat and discuss more. I think that's great if you stay on for that. I do understand if people leave for other things, but it's great if you do ask your questions through the Q&A, because I think that's the way to go forward after we are done here with Martin's speech. But also remember, specific questions to Martin, and then more general questions that we can discuss afterwards. With that, Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hjalmar. Do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Excellent. So I'd like to thank you for inviting me here and everybody who's listening. And I'm going to take some of the ideas that have been discussed a lot by Kevin and maybe take them to a bit different environment. And it was nice for me that Eliza started her presentation by saying, once upon a time, Degerö was an agricultural wetland, as I'm really going to be talking about constructed agricultural wetlands and what their role is in the landscape. And Well, I think they have been, they were an important part of Sweden a long time ago, and maybe they can be an important part again. And as Hjalmar mentioned, this is a Naturvårdsverket funded project. We've got partners from Aarhus University, Uppsala University, SLU, and a film production company. I'm trying to see if I can get what I need to, oh yeah, great, it's gone down. So I'm going to be taking you into a different kind of landscape than we've been in all day. And I'm imagining that some of you are kind of zoomed out. So I hope I can just show you what this landscape looks like and maybe convince you that this is an interesting and relevant landscape in which to be working. So with our project, we had 4 research questions. We wanted to be able to document the impact of constructed agricultural wetlands on hydrological processes, both at a local scale and in the larger catchment. We wanted to learn something more about wetland multifunctionality, specifically how can we couple hydrological ecosystem services to nutrient retention and a positive greenhouse gas balance. What influences wetland effectiveness, both the factors we can control and the factors we cannot control? And how are wetlands perceived by relevant stakeholders? And this last point, I'd argue, is quite important. In any work I've done where we've tried to have public engagement, there's 2 ways you can go. You can either try and target the few relevant people, or you can try and target everyone, and figure you'll get the relevant people if you target everyone. So we've gone with the second way. And one of the things that I'm really excited about with this project is that we're going to devote a lot of our resources to making a broadcast quality film about agricultural wetlands and the role they play in the landscape. And our goal is that if people spend 20, 25 minutes watching this film that we're going to make, they'll come away and say, wow, these wetlands, I'd never really thought about it before, but they're kind of important. So that's kind of the message I'm hoping we can get out with our project. And as I said, we got the 4 research questions. So we've got a hydrological hypothesis that if we've got a catchment, rain coming in blue, runoff going out red, little bit of evapotranspiration, little bit of infiltration. If we can put a wetland into the landscape, we can reduce the runoff, we can increase the recharge, and we can increase the evapotranspiration so that we can see some benefits. We can see potentially local evapotranspirative cooling, we can see groundwater recharge, and we can see the possibility of flattening the curve. This phrase meant something very different a year ago, I know, but the idea that maybe wetlands in the landscape can contribute to reducing flood peaks and maintaining base flows, I still think is worth exploring. Now, we're interested in multifunctionality. So specifically, how can we couple hydrological ecosystem services with desirable biogeochemical functioning and biodiversity? Hjalmar, at the start of this day, had said forest ditches are maybe the least loved part of the water landscape. I'd argue that if you've got an agricultural wetland like this, it's probably running a close second in the least loved competition. And if we're thinking about the combination of nutrients and greenhouse gases, this is some work that Marcus did with colleagues in Uppsala recently, looking at the biogeochemistry of urban ponds. And what they found was that there is a positive relationship between nutrient status and methane emissions. The more phosphorus you have, the greater the methane emissions. So we took that in mind to see if we could demonstrate that or see that going on in the wetlands we were working with. So we did a preliminary campaign this year looking at input-output budgets of a series of constructed wetlands, taking cores from the inlet of the wetland, or as Kevin would say, the tap in the bathtub and then the drain in the bathtub. Cores in the inlet and outlet have quite different physical characteristics. We also took greenhouse gas measurements at the inlet, the outlet, and within the wetland. And what we found surprised us a little bit. We found that, well, this was encouraging, that there were significantly lower sediment P in the outflows. This is what we were hoping for. The wetlands are working So nutrient retention wetlands are working. That was certainly encouraging. Sediment phosphorus and organic matter are positively correlated. So the more organic matter we had in the sediments, the greater the amount of P we had. We're still exploring why that might be, and the fractionation of the phosphorus, whether it's more or less available. Unsurprisingly, almost all sites emit methane. A little bit surprising, wetlands that we looked at could be both sources and sinks for CO2. And this was surprising for us. There was no obvious relationship between the greenhouse gas emissions and the nutrient status. So this is something we're exploring further, and we'll take on board with the wider sampling we do next year. So the other aspect we wanted to look at was biodiversity. And in our consortium, we didn't really have the necessary biodiversity expertise to look at this, but one of the strengths of these Naturvårdsverket funded projects is we've been encouraged to collaborate. So we've been working with a project led by Stockholm University, where they've been doing biodiversity surveys in wetlands, and we've been doing nutrient measurements. And our hope is that this will link up later this year or early next year with some better understanding between the relationship of wetland trophic status and the potential for desirable biodiversity. Looking at the hydrology is complicated. We're hoping that we can show that wetlands have a capacity to flatten the curve. And the tool that we're using for this is our cloud-based hydrological modeling environment. We're using this for a number of projects right now. We like it because it's fairly easy to tackle more specialized questions than can easily be addressed in other models. But this is something we're seeing where it's going. Looking also at connectivity as it's not just one wetland in the landscape, it's thinking about multiple wetlands in the landscape. And Faruk Jojek, Pia Garanmaya and colleagues have now got a study published looking at the actual nutrient retention for a series of wetlands in a catchment. So trying to understand the connectivity aspects of nutrient retention. I think that feeds into the connectivity aspects of flood risk mitigation, which maybe can be upscaled to make some sort of recommendations for how we ought to site wetlands in a catchment if we want to, say, have the optimal flood risk reduction potential. Now that's the natural sciences part, but these wetlands are very much water bodies in a human-dominated and a human-constructed landscape. So we're also looking at social aspects, and we're exploring the interactions and the perceptions of three groups of individuals: farmers, authorities, and landowners. And this is the first project I've been involved in where all of the messaging is not targeted exclusively at the farmers. And I think that's really important in a Swedish context, as I believe it's something like 2/3 of the farmland is owned by somebody other than the person who is farming the land. So much of the farmland in Sweden is farmed by leaseholders, and it does seem that it's the contracts or the institutional arrangements that perhaps influence really what can or cannot be done with the landscape. So we're trying to get a better handle on who actually can make the decisions so that we can target any communications to the actual decision makers, as well as the people, the farmers who implement the decisions. So we've got a series of natural science questions. We've got a series of social science questions. They go together into something which in this picture looks like clockwork. I'm quite certain it's going to be a little bit more complicated when we get to it. But one of the things I'm really optimistic about is that we've got a whole series of kind of a constellation of supporting or contributing projects. So there are two other Naturvårdsverket projects that we're already working with. There's a wetland win-win. I've translated its Swedish name. That's the group we're doing the biodiversity work with. We're planning next year to do a detailed greenhouse gas study with a group in Holland, the Optimizing Future Wetlands. We're coupled into other Swedish projects funded by HAV and Jordbruksverket. And one of the things that I think is encouraging is we've got connections to 2 cost projects. So we're connected to the Flood for Land project, which is concerned with understanding the institutional arrangements that encourage people to flood their land so as to protect downstream land. And I think that could be very important for understanding the rationale for why one might put a wetland for hydrological functionality on one's land. We're also working with the PAS4W, which is Payment for Ecosystem Services, Forest Water. It's got forest in the name, but it's not like a forest that was in any of these previous slides. It's really about small trees or small numbers of trees in agricultural catchments and understanding how mitigation measures in agricultural catchments can improve the hydrological cycle. We're working with a couple of European level projects. The BioWater Nordic Center of Excellence recently funded a Horizon 2020 project on small water features in agricultural landscapes. And one of the things that I really like about this is that the insights that we get with the greenhouse gas work in this project are going to feed back into the next round of IPCC reporting. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. And I'd like to, well, actually, I mix up in slides, say the 4 things we're trying to do. We want to extend the evidence base. We want to provide credible estimates of the implications of a changing climate. We want to identify specifically the institutional factors that influence whether a wetland is created, maintained, or restored. And we want to develop a film highlighting the unique potential of wetlands that we really hope is going to lead to more people being aware of wetlands and the important role they play in the landscape, and hopefully through that contributing to their greater uptake and their greater prevalence in the landscape. So with that, I'd like to thank a lot of people. Specifically, I'd like to thank Mike Peacock for providing all the photos you've seen today, but also to thank all of you for sticking with this through the day, and to Hjalmar for inviting me.
And I thank you, Martin, for an excellent presentation. Super nice to see this, and expanding the horizon from just forested areas to also include wetlands, which is of course an extremely important part of the landscape, not just in southern Sweden but also up here in the north. Do you see, Martin, any connection to more forested oriented projects in your? Is there a potential collaboration potential there that you can?
I would certainly like that. Yes, I think in some ways we face a lot of very similar questions. Certainly the hydrology, I think, well, physics is physics. I think the perception issues are similar, as it seems that there are some people who would like to see, say, more wetlands in forests for different sorts of ecosystem service delivery. There are other people who are very much against them, and I think maybe this is part of what the WAMBAF project is looking at with reintroduction of beavers as a wetland ecosystem engineer. And certainly I think, yeah, really, if we're going to have successful reintroduction or redevelopment of wetlands in any sort of landscape, we got to consider the social dimensions as well, and what factors are going to make these sort of things acceptable to people.
Good, thank you. I will then open up the floor here. Actually, now there comes the question from Jan Seibert here to you, Martin. Nice idea with the film. Any ideas on how to communicate our lack of full understanding while still saying what is known? Thank you, Jan. That's a good opening for further discussion, I think. Yeah, Martin.
I think humility is important, to say that we do know some things and we can make decisions based on some evidence. I think one of the challenges we've had as environmental scientists is 20 or 30 years ago, we had modelers who said, oh yeah, we know everything from the model. And I think that gave a bit of a bad reputation, as I think people were perhaps overly arrogant and saying that they knew everything, sort of what my old colleagues used to say, it's a sort of a trust me, I'm with the government kind of thing. So I think if we are humble and respect our limitations, I've always found that brings people on board and does raise the acceptability of whatever I might be saying.
Thank you. Now we also open up the floor to ask a question to anyone in the panel, if that's of. Oh, if there are questions, we'll continue until we have no more questions. So
I think it'd be great if all of the panelists joined.
Yeah, that would be great.
Might stimulate. Great. Or not everybody there.
Good. Yeah. Okay, we have a question from Ishiba from here. How long term is the Trollberget project planned for? That's a good question. Now, Tobias Eriksson, who is at Länsstyrelsen, he is in one of the attendees to this. Of course, he can't talk because it's.
We can let him talk, maybe, if he wants.
We can let him talk. Yeah. Let's see if he's still
Invite
there.
him to. Let's see.
I'm not sure if he's still there. Tobias, if you're there, you're gonna just or.
I think he might have just left.
He might have just left. Well, the problem, the Life on Grip project has funding until 2023. That's when the funding runs out. Then, of course, there hopefully be opportunities to continue the funding somehow. But the basic funding comes from Grip on Life, EU Life project, through the County Administration Board and the Forest Agency, who is paying, you could say, half-half for the Trollberget basic monitoring. Lennart Henriksson, right. I'm very happy that you have started research on ditch cleaning, because there is a very poor scientific basis for ditch cleaning that takes place every day on a fairly large scale in Swedish forest. However, I lack the biological perspective. What do brown trout and the dragonfly say when their streams is allowed to receive water from a ditch cleaned area? That's a very good question, and I should actually say that some of this our interest in ditch cleaning comes from Lennart Henriksson, perhaps in 5 to 10 years ago, when he was one of the practitioners in the Future Forage project, who actually asked us specifically, you have to do more work on ditch cleaning. And I said, ditch cleaning, who wants to work with ditch cleaning? That sounds extremely boring. But I'm glad, Lennart, that you have you continued your discussion about that, and that we actually started to think about this more in detail. But you were one of the early people that were on our case on this. Yes, we do need broader perspectives on what you're saying. We do need people to look at more the ecological effects on stream water. I think we have that online, but we also need the more people involved with the terrestrial part of this experiment, both when it comes to the ditch cleaning and the restoration work. But
you mean the biological part?
The biological part, yes. Sorry, yes, the biological part. We are just, the research facility is open for anyone that is interested in working there. So please, if you know somebody that is super interested in this question, come and tell them about us and tell them that they have to come here and work.
But maybe Mika or Hanu can say something about, the water quality that is exported downstream and how that affects biology, and if, the studies that have been done so far in Finland.
Yeah, maybe I can say something. I'm not an ecologist, but I'm following these studies as well. There are, for example, one group in Oulu who has been focusing on this particularly, and they do have influence on the streams, especially if you have a poor management of these water systems. So one of the big influence what we have seen that if there are some sediment transport, that they're blocking the beds and causing this direct physical influence on the bed conditions especially in the small streams, but also it can be these mineral particles, fine sand or clay, but also the organic sediments. And then there is also some more evidence that especially if the DOC concentrations are increasing, it will influence directly on the lightning conditions and also these macro-invertible communities in the streams. So it does have influence.
Thank you. Yeah.
We have another. We'll start with Jan Seibert's questions here. While there are clear differences between the Swedish EPA project, looking at it a little from the outside, we're all doing the same thing. Do we need to consider this type of communication of our respective results to the public? I think it's directly towards Martin's presentation with making like a high quality film. I get the feeling that Jan is kind of arguing that the film that we made was not so high quality, but that's fine. Martin? Do you think that we need to think about this more? Communications.
I think it's always good to be thinking about that. Yeah. I don't think there is any sort of contradictory message in anything that I have heard today. I do think they're complementary, and I am encouraged to see that there is the awareness of the need to communicate or make the results useful. For example, the project Kevin presented, if SMHI can build this into a decision support tool, I think that's very helpful. And if you've got a life project that is working on these issues, I'm sure you've got a big communication and engagement component. So I don't think I don't think we have to try and say we're all doing the same thing, because well, in some ways we are, but it's maybe almost trivial to be saying that, like we're all working with water. But I think we're addressing different questions in a complementary way.
No, I don't think he was questioning that. I think it was more, do we do more natural science perspective project also think more about reaching out to the public the way you have done with your films? So should we think more about thinking of ways of reach the public with our results?
Definitely, as ultimately the public are the ones who are paying our salaries. So if they have a positive perception of us, that maybe can help us if we are in a situation where there's, say, threats of funding cuts or reallocation of funds. If a lot of people have a positive opinion of the environmental science work that's done in Sweden, I think that helps all of us in a very tangible way.
Good. Yeah, I mean, we also have very good experience from making high quality films from Future Forest, and that's won a lot of prizes. And I know, Martin, you are also involved in in a lot of filmmaking. So I think it's been very useful. But do you think there is a limitations in how many films how you can reach out with your films? I mean, YouTube is of course one way of reaching out with your film, but is there other ways?
Ideally, getting the films into the schools, if the film can actually be broadcast. As I do think YouTube is a bit of just getting the people who are already converted. You may win a few converts with a YouTube film, but I don't think you're going to reach the general public. So I do think we've got to still be working on how we think about doing or how we think about targeting our outputs. But yeah, getting them into the schools, if we can get them broadcast, I think really any way we can raise exposure, anytime that we can give content that people want to look at, I think that's just a good thing, as it raises awareness of the issues that all of us work on. And it'll give, I hope, people a more positive perception of why we do the things we do.
Good. Thank you. We have a very interesting question or comment from Sebastian Sundberg here. Based on what you measure and model, based on that you measure and model so many characteristics in the Krycklan area, it would be nice to scale up and see what are the net cost, monetary and on the ecosystem of draining wetlands and then restore them or to drain them or ditch clean to national and global scale, regarding carbon loading, greenhouse gases, mercury, nutrient and stuff, and so on. I think that's a very good comment, and I think that's perhaps where we want to go next. But I think what Krycklan is trying to do is trying to provide some kind of empirical basis, and then we can use that for scaling up. Anyone wants to comment on that? But I think the upscaling and calculating the cost is very interesting.
If I could just make a quick comment, I think that sort of question does fall within the remit of what CITES is trying to do and what the LTER program is trying to do, and it might be something that we can sort of put into a sort of a European or a national kind of perspective. So there are projects that Krycklan is a part of that might be able to lift up those questions.
Yes, good, thank you.
One other comment is that, I mean, it's very often to get stuck in case studies. And how do you scale case studies, right? So one part of our initiatives is to go beyond that and try to make it more general, to look at potential of specific objects to behave in a certain fashion. And I think that can be used in scaling in a fairly efficient way.
That's a good comment. Yeah.
I also have a comment on that, and I think several of the projects presented here, they are very much focusing on the Trollberget facility, but there is also a spatial component in them. So they will try to use the knowledge we gain from Trollberget in order to scale it to regional or even beyond that level.
No, I agree. I mean, the synoptic study that you present and that Karin present and that we present and maybe others are really, really relevant here.
Yeah. Good. And you should think to coordinate your efforts there if it's possible. But with that, we have one more question, Matthias Sundqvist. We talk some about minimizing the floods, but another important thing to look at is the effect of smaller streams during dry periods. I've been noticing the catchment area with big amount of ditches tend to dry out totally, with losses of biological diversity during some summer periods like we had in Västerbotten in 2017-18. And that's a very good comment, Matthias, and I think that's what both Kevin and Martin was talking about, flattening out the curves. I mean, you decrease the peak floods and you increase the low floods, right? And that's It's not really what we think about flattening curves right now. That's in Corona times. It's only lowering the peaks, not so much increasing the baseline. But otherwise, it's a perfect analogy. And my friends of Krycklan and others, I thank you very, very much. It's 13 minutes past 4, and before I end this, it's going to be quarter after, and I promise to end by then. I thank all the speakers. I thank especially the Eliza, for which out her this would not have happened. I thank all the other participants. We had 165 participants in total, which is incredible. And I thank also especially the invited speakers, Hannu and Mika, for bringing in the Finnish perspective, and of course, Heli and Vicky, who helped organize this. Thank you very much. Next year, Krycklan Symposium will hopefully go back to some more normal agenda. But in the meantime, keep up the good work and welcome back to Krycklan. Cheers.
Thank you.